In the meantime, I'd like to make my own presentation with Professor Kondoh, which will be very short, which is supposed to conclude the book. This is, the presentation material. In fact, the point is how to address questions posed. In fact, three questions. Three questions were posed in introduction chapter of this book. Then that will be highlights of the concluding chapter. Then I would go first, and Professor Kondoh would conclude. Then the questions posed the introductions threefolds. Number one was the dynamics common between Japan and South Korea on ODA. Number two was yes or no question, or which one national interest or global public goods to be prioritized. Then number three is forward-looking questions. What to do hereafter for cooperation between Japan and South Korea. Then you might notice that all those three are very tough questions, so that our answers were kind of something we try to get, but not 100% confident. But let us give the following way. One of the common underlying dynamics of ODA behind experience of Korea and Japan is that both countries pass by experiences of industrialization, making use of assistance. Some other countries, Australia, New Zealand, Scandinavian countries do not follow this way of combination of assistance and industrialization. So that somehow Korean and Japanese assume that international cooperation, even after we become a donor, will be so-called naturally would be associated with industrialization. That sounds like a sense or notion both Korean and Japanese have in mind as a consequence of international cooperation. Then, through that process, involvement of private firms were natural as well. And the point is that the involvement of domestic private firms were commonly and widely observed and attempted. So that involvement of both Japanese companies as Korean company into the process of international cooperation sounds like a norm of international cooperation from these two countries. That is one of underlying mechanism commonly applicable to the experience of South Korea and Japan. Then the answer to the second question seems to be arbitrary, but this is from motivation of this book or sentiment the contributor shared to push forward this project. Even though the national interests were driving force, you might realize that when we started this project, the administration of the United States was with Donald Trump, so that the national interest was dominant notion to be involved. But the contributor of this book believed that the international development cooperation should have more, global public aspects, as Professor Kim Yumi emphasized in the welcoming speech in the beginning of the seminar today. So that is a reply to the second question. And the third, the forward-looking strategy would have one input, which is that related to nature of Korea and Japan's international cooperation with the private sector. One of our observations is that in many cases, that the scope of PPP, public-private partnership, seems to be limited, or kind of in a sense, again, limited to the scope of private firms, private sector. In a sense that the private firm has its own agenda, its own scope of production activities, service delivery activities, then they would approach to the international cooperation. Then the side of international cooperation adjusts and accommodates the capacity of private sector, not the other way around. It seems that the expansion or enlargement of capacity or the scope of private sector have rarely happened. Then what would, ahead for the future challenge would be expanding, more enlarging the scope of private sector for the addressing the benefits of the beneficiaries in developing countries. So that is one input to the circulation. Then now Professor Kondoh would take over the presentation. So I would go the slide of his presentation. Professor Kondoh, now it's your turn to say your views.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, Professor Yamagata. And I'm also profoundly grateful for the Professor Kwon and GDI members to arrange this very precious opportunity today. Okay, so it's my pleasure to have my presentation today. Let's move on. So as Professor Yamagata very precisely summarized key findings of this book, I would like to briefly discuss the three possible implications for further exploration. Okay, first, in a concluding chapter, we highlighted the similarities and the differences of Korean aid and Japanese aid. As regards the similarities, both Korean aid and Japanese aid shared our experiences of the remarkable industrial development and also our attention to economic cooperation, and our passive stance to Western country-led norms, and our elaborated balance of the national interest and the universal values, and finally, our weak partnership with the civil society. And I'm wondering why we share so many similarities. To answer this question, I'm wondering if the timing to be donors may also matter. I mean, Japan started to offer its aid earlier than South Korea. And then when the South Korea started its aid, the South Korea analyzed other donors' aid, I'm sure, okay? And one of the important information sources for South Korea might be the Japanese aid. So if South Korea did learn something from the Japanese aid, I think it would be natural that this learning process created more similarities rather than the differences between the two donors. Okay, and also this book mentioned the differences between the two donors are marginal. I mean, our differences have been certainly marginal when we compared both aid of the past several decades. But what I would like to discuss is how about our aid in future? Will we still look alike, or will we diverge our aid? So if we overview our aid in more dynamic terms, the both Korean aid and Japanese aid might have already been in the process of the mutual differentiation. In fact, South Korea succeeded in enacting the International Development Cooperation Basic Law, but while Japan also consolidated the Japanese aid agencies into JICA. And for me, the Korean aid seems to be more proactive to the international development norms. So my point is how the two donors may differentiate their aid and why. So I'm very interested in these questions. Okay, and probably these questions could be explored by the future comparative analysis. Okay. The second, we have already found that both Korean aid and Japanese aid are reinforcing roles of the private sector, as the Professor Yamagata just mentioned now. And essentially, the recent public policies is made and implemented not only by the government, but the public policy is more formulated through the good governance, in which the various stakeholders participate. In addition, when both countries share the financial constraints, particularly Japan may have the serious financial constraint, and when we need to mobilize knowledge and the resources of the public sectors and the private sectors, I think it would be natural to reinforce roles of the public sectors to expand the volumes of our aid, and also to improve the quality of our aid. So recent attention to the PPP actually illustrates this point. And my question is the interest of the private sector wouldn't be monolithic. I mean the business interest and the, like I say, the CSO. I'm not sure the CSO could be included to the private sector, because often the private sector is just mentioned the business sectors, but they now would like to understand the business sectors and the CSOs into the same category. The CSO actually their interests might be sometimes conflictual. So in addition, the issue wouldn't be whether we should exclude the business interest in our aid. Probably the interest would be critically the issue would be to critically examine the nature of the win-win, as this conclusion of this book mentioned. So as already indicated, the win-win is often the more beneficial to the donors and the donors' business sector. So for further exploration, we could compare the nature of the win-win between the Korean aid and the Japanese aid. Okay, and finally, the Korea-Japan collaboration. For more political considerations, if South Korea and Japan had joint actions, they may effectively increase the pressure on the recipient countries, as already indicated by Professor Yamagata concluding chapter. Sorry. On the project level, both Korean aid and Japanese aid have already accumulated the several joint aid projects. So our collaboration has already started, at least on the project level. And on the more macro level, both countries may assist other very new emerging donors for example, in Southeast Asia. The South Korea and Japan gradually improved our aid, and also some of our experiences might be relevant and useful for other Southeast Asian countries, which which have just just started to offer the aid. So probably the South Korean new South Korean donors may in future would like to improve their aid, the quality of their aid. So that if possible, the South Korea and Japan may assist these new donors in some ways. Okay, that's it for myself. Thank you very much.
Professor Kondoh, thank you very much for concluding the presentation with me.